It's time now for our Scoop, our weekly conversation on international media and the political and economic headwinds confronting the industry. We look at who shapes the narrative, explore journalistic ethics, and ask the reporters the difficult questions. With trust in the press at a nadir, it's a critical eye on a critical profession. Jason Rezaian is a former Tehran bureau chief of the Washington Post, and from 2014, the Iranian-American journalist was jailed for 544 days in Evin prison, a notorious facility where dissidents and political prisoners are held. He recounted in detail the psychological torture he suffered in his book, Prisoner. Earlier this month, Rezaian published a video on why it's hard now for journalists to cover Iran.
There are massive shifts happening inside Iran right now. Bombs are still dropping, but there are few international news outlets with a presence inside the country. Many reasons explain why journalists are ill-equipped to cover this story right now. A lot of that is because the Iranian government has made it all but impossible for journalists to operate inside the country. But it's also because the media often distills the story of Iran into simply good versus evil arguments or discussions about the country's nuclear program. It's a massive country of over 90 million people from a wide range of ethnic, religious, and linguistic backgrounds, and it has more than 2,500 years of history. It simply can't be distilled into black and white.
A few days later, Rezaian and his colleague Liam Scott did a Q&A with CNN's chief international correspondent, Clisser Ward, on the very same issue. Ward said, quote, "The primary challenge is that we can't be on the ground inside Iran." Jason and Liam added, it's harder to illustrate a nuanced portrait of what this conflict means for Iranians. It's harder to capture the range of emotions, joy, grief, fear that many Iranians are feeling simultaneously. And then on Thursday, CNN reported this.
CNN is the first U.S. network allowed into the country since the start of the war. And I do want to point out, CNN operates in Iran only with government permission. Here's Fred's report.
We just crossed the border and are now inside of Iran. The Iranian government has granted us a visa to come here and to report from the Islamic Republic of Iran. We're now trying to make our way to the capital, Tehran, as fast as possible.
And that access is important, but it almost certainly comes with strings attached. For Iran, it gets a better chance to control the narrative by showing the destruction of U.S. and Israeli strikes, but CNN will unlikely be allowed to interview critics of the regime. France 24 has a correspondent. Reza Saya provides crucial information about the strikes, the human toll, and Iran's response.
Death toll is now more than 1,000 people, killed, hundreds of them civilians. Iranian officials are saying 153 cities have been hit, and 1,000 locations have been targeted. And increasingly, we are seeing more and more videos, pictures, gruesome images of civilians who are bearing the brunt of this war.
Now, anyone reporting in Iran must walk a tightrope of what they can say and what they cannot say. On its Press Freedom Index, Reporters Without Borders ranks Iran 176th out of 180 countries, highlighting that the main source of information on Iran comes from abroad, with the domestic media landscape dominated by state propaganda. For more, let's speak to Jonathan Dagher. He is the head of the organization's Middle East desk. Hello to you, Jonathan. Thank you for coming in.
Thank you for having me.
First of all, I think reporting at wartime is difficult for any journalist, but this comes amid an internet blackout and a crackdown on anyone critical of the regime.
Evidently, journalists are usually among the first who are on the line of fire in any war, but here we're talking about one of the most repressive countries in the world, and it has been that way, unfortunately, for years. I would say that Iran's journalists widely in Iran, not just Iranian journalists, all journalists in Iran today and journalists in the zone, in the Gulf, all the way to Lebanon, in the region, are facing a catastrophe that is unprecedented in scale and in impact and in danger. We're really going towards the unknown, and it's more important than ever to protect and to defend these journalists, particularly in places such as Iran, where the repression was already very difficult. There are almost at least 19 journalists who are currently detained by the Iranian regime, and they have been so for months and for years for some of them. Journalists are threatened. Journalists are having to work amidst media blackout.
Just to step in there, what sort of threats are they hearing, the journalists?
I mean, we're talking aside from the American-Israeli offensive, where we've been receiving reports from journalists who are literally evacuating cities and hiding from the bombs. Atop of that, journalists have also been facing threats of the kind where agents affiliated to a certain ministry, for example, or the government or the regime more broadly, because of its different actors, they will get a phone call, for example, or several phone calls. Some of them are nice, some of them are more threatening in tone, but all of them have one objective: it's to censor. They basically warn the journalists not to cover a certain topic, to toe the line, to be careful what they say and what they don't say. Usually, this is disguised under terms such as preserving the peace or national unity, or all of these other terms that repressive regimes usually employ. Journalists also face imprisonment. They can have armed forces showing up at their home at any time, or their offices, their material confiscated, their computers, their phones. They can be taken for interrogations. Sometimes this ends up with them being imprisoned for years for some of them. Sometimes they are released a short while after, but the message is received.
Yeah, and for any time, in anywhere in the world, the truth is important, and even more so at wartime. Without an established independent media, there isn't anyone to contest U.S. or Israeli claims or the Iranian regime's claims. Have you been speaking to journalists in Iran? Do you know if they're working, if they're fleeing? What have you heard?
We are in touch directly and indirectly with some journalists, because even speaking to media outlets abroad can put them in grave danger of arrest. Evidently, today what's at stake is our right as a public to be informed, the Iranian people's right to be informed and to have access to a wide range of information that is both, as you said, critical and supportive of both sides, perhaps. The point here is the truth. Journalists in Iran are having a really hard time covering this truth, because there are very strict red lines that are very dangerous to cross. For example, journalists have been telling us that after the assassination of Khamenei, for example, the supreme leaders, there were people celebrating, for example, in the streets. They were evidently happy that the dictator was gone, despite, and I'm quoting the journalist who spoke to me, despite them being really upset and devastated by the scale of the tragedy and civilian deaths around them. There was this little bit of good news in it all. And for example, this journalist told us that you would not see this relief anywhere in the newspaper coverage the next day, knowing that the journalists themselves who published these newspapers were celebrating. That is, I think it shows to which point the information is controlled and surveilled. They don't have free internet access. They don't have any means of communicating information freely to the outside world. Very few actually can connect to the internet. We've been looking at the media blackout since the protests way before the American and Israeli offensive that started last weekend.
Yeah, and can you give us an idea, paint us a picture, if you will, about what sort of information is disseminated on the state media or in these newspapers in Iran?
We will find a lot of pro-government and pro-regime coverage. For example, a lot of I would say anything that serves the political and military interest today of the regime will get published, but that isn't new. That is something that unfortunately has been going on for a very long time. Even like we go back to the women life protests, women life protests that started in 2022 and the death of Mahsa Amini, for example. State media did not want to report on the death of this young Kurdish student, and it was independent journalists who actually went and who proved that she was killed in police custody, and they went and they covered her funeral. And here I remember Elahi Mohammadi and Nilufar Hamedi, who paid a very heavy price, spending nearly 2 years in prison. And Elahi Mohammadi was recently rearrested for a few hours and had her material confiscated. So this is the kind of information that the regime does not want covered. Today, obviously, there are strikes all across the country. There is a lot to say about the civilian toll of these strikes. There are human catastrophes and tragedies that are taking place, unfortunately. The journalists should be able to go cover, but even when journalists have permission from government agencies to go and to cover, according to our information, they are still facing difficulties. They are still taken to the side. Their photographs are still being deleted by policemen and by security forces.
Yeah, and do you think the supreme leader is dead, but his regime is still in place? Do you think the powers that be that are still there are doubling down on their sort of pressing the press because they want to ensure that they have control over everything that goes out?
That is information that I have based on the journalists who speak with us, who tell us that the repression actually increased after the Supreme Leader's death. And to quote one journalist, the Supreme Leader is not a person, he is a system. And that system is still in place.
I want to ask you before we leave, this conflict is spreading. There are concerns, of course, with what we're seeing in Lebanon, elsewhere in the Gulf. Give us a quick summary, if you can, about the media coverage as this war worsens.
The Gulf region in general is also very repressive for journalists, and we've been seeing entire campaigns orchestrated by the governments of these countries, from Saudi Arabia to Oman to Kuwait, discouraging citizens in general from taking photos under the guise of national security, but legitimate concerns about national security in these contexts and in these repressive regimes can very quickly become tools of repression that can target any journalist anywhere. And we are very worried about that. And we've also been seeing tension in between these countries recently that we also worry that journalists will be amongst the first to pay the price, because history tells us they are the first to pay the price. In Lebanon, we are facing an offensive and an invasion of a scale that is unprecedented so far. We fear it's going to be really catastrophic of course, for the Lebanese, but also for journalists who are covering this war. In the past war in 2024, at least 7 journalists were directly targeted and killed by Israeli forces while they were covering the war or in the context of their work. Right now, we do not have any casualties, and I hope it stays this way. But we have dozens of journalists who have been forcibly displaced from the south and from the southern suburbs of Beirut following evacuation threats by the Israeli forces in recent days. If I can just say that our call as RSF today is to all the actors engaged in this conflict across the entire region. It is primordial to ensure the protection of journalists who are working today despite all of these dangers. The protection of journalists, the right to free, independent information is not a luxury. It does not fall just because there is war. It does not become secondary to conflict. It is precisely during these moments that it is more important than ever to ensure the protection of journalists, to avoid, definitely not to target them, because targeting them is a war crime and they will be prosecuted. This is what we are here for. But also to ensure that they can continue to work without any obstacles. This goes to American and Israeli forces in Iran, but also to the Iranian regime, who should immediately liberate all the journalists imprisoned in its prisons.
Jonathan, thank you very much for your time. Jonathan Dagher from Reporters Without Borders. Thank you. That brings us to our quote of the week. The New York Times looked at videos circulating on social media and through Iranian state-run news channels and said it showed a distorted view of the war. Tiffany Hu, Stephen Lee Myers, and Stuart A. Thompson wrote, quote, advances in artificial intelligence tools have allowed countries at war to supercharge their propaganda campaigns, creating and spreading seemingly realistic videos and images as fast as their adversaries can debunk them. A result is to compound confusion over what is really happening on the battlefield, which in this case has spread throughout the region. That's it for this edition of Scoop. Thank you for watching, and please stay tuned to France 24.